Okay, today we're going to shatter a pretty massive Hollywood myth. We're diving into the really surprising truth about cinema's absolute greatest directors and their, honestly, incredibly delayed paths to Oscar gold. We usually think of an Oscar win as this immediate stamp of cinematic royalty, right? But sometimes, well, it's actually a stark reminder of just how long Hollywood can overlook true, undeniable genius before a total masterpiece basically forces their hand. I absolutely love looking at film history through this lens, because it really changes how we view our favorite movies.
So let's jump right into this. I want you to picture the absolute most iconic cinematic moments from the 1970s and 80s. Seriously, picture that massive boulder rolling after Indiana Jones. Picture that glowing alien finger from E.T. Or, a giant mechanical shark just terrorizing Amity Island. Now I want you to ask yourself, when did Steven Spielberg, literally the guy who practically invented the modern blockbuster, actually win his first Best Director prize? You'd probably assume it was for one of those early culture-defining hits, wouldn't you?
Well, get this. The answer is actually 1994, for Schindler's List. It's a genuinely wild historical fact. Legendary, industry-changing juggernauts like Jaws, E.T., and Raiders of the Lost Ark. They all came and went without the Academy handing the world's most famous director their top directing prize. He literally had to wait decades. But here's the secret. He wasn't being completely ignored.
Section 1. Spielberg's Technical Track. From sci-fi spectacles to historical masterpieces.
You see, highly specialized technical categories were secretly paving the way for Spielberg's legacy way before he ever lifted that Best Director trophy. If you look at this timeline, he essentially conquered those early technical categories with his massive action films, and then eventually commanded the dramatic prestige categories in the 1990s. Basically, the Academy was rewarding his films. They recognized the sheer technical brilliance of what he was throwing up on the screen, even if they just weren't quite ready to hand him the overarching Director's Award yet. Let's zoom in on 1984 with Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Now, this film notoriously divided critics when it dropped, mostly because of its much darker tone compared to Raiders. But look at what it actually achieved. It set a completely new standard for action cinema. Through its groundbreaking miniature work, those insane heart-pounding minecart chase sequences, and just top-tier practical effects, his vision was undeniable. The Academy practically had to recognize his visual genius, and it rightfully took home the Oscar for Best Visual Effects.
And that evolution, it kept right on going in 1989 with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Spielberg figured out very early on that immersion is exactly half audio. From those iconic cracking whips to the roaring tanks and echoing caverns, The Last Crusade proved his films weren't just visual spectacles, they were massive sonic experiences. It ended up winning the Oscar for sound effects editing, so the Academy was definitely taking notes.
For years, the industry kind of boxed him in, labeling him a quote-unquote popcorn filmmaker. But then came this incredible evolution. First, into a masterful dramatic storyteller with Schindler's List in 1993, shot in that stark, unforgettable black and white, sweeping 7 Oscars. And then he became a total genre redefiner. Just 5 years later, with Saving Private Ryan, he rewrote the war genre forever using that harrowing, desaturated, handheld cinematography. He won his second Best Director trophy and completely, permanently shed that early popcorn label.
Section 2. The Long Wait. Christopher Nolan and David Fincher's Path.
Because, as it turns out, Spielberg is far from the only visionary who had to wait decades for that top-tier validation. Modern icons like Christopher Nolan and David Fincher, they repeat this exact same pattern. For years, Nolan delivered these huge paradigm-shifting films that swept technical categories. Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, they won for visual effects, sound editing, sound mixing, film editing. But Best Director? Nope. And then there's Fincher. The Social Network wins film editing, original score, adapted screenplay. But his personal Best Director status, to this day, it remains famously pending. But check this out. The turning point for Nolan is right here, 2024. Think about it. For over 2 decades, Nolan delivered some of the most masterful, mind-bending hits in cinema history. Yet, he was sitting there entirely without a Best Picture or Best Director win until the 96th Academy Awards. That was when Oppenheimer finally just dominated the conversation, sweeping 7 Oscars, including that ultimate directing prize. History really does repeat itself, doesn't it?
Which brings us to Section 3, Why Technical Oscars Matter. The Director as the Conductor.
All of this raises a pretty critical question. Why exactly do so many legendary directors rack up technical Oscars years, sometimes decades, before they actually win Best Director? Well, it's because directing isn't just about standing on set calling action or, guiding actors through their emotional beats. A truly great director is really the overarching conductor of an entire production orchestra. They're the ones up there pushing cinematic technology into totally uncharted territory.
When a movie takes home gold in these categories, it's definitely not happening in a vacuum. Visual effects and cinematography, those are direct reflections of a director's unique visual language. Sound editing and mixing, that reflects the director's highly specific sense of pacing and atmosphere, literally how they want you to feel the movie in your chest. And film editing, that's where the director's story is fundamentally rewritten and stitched together in post. So when a film wins for these specific crafts, it's really acting as a proxy for the director's brilliant overall vision.
Section 4. The legendary snubs. Directors who never won Best Director.
Because sometimes that wait for Best Director isn't just long, it's eternal. And this brings us to a rather sobering truth about Hollywood awards. Winning a competitive Oscar does not exclusively define a filmmaker's legacy. In fact, history often proves the Academy was just spectacularly late to the party. Look at these undeniable foundational masterpieces of cinema. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Citizen Kane, Psycho. You know what the number of competitive Best Director wins is for the men who made them? 0. Tragically, the absolute masterminds behind some of the greatest films ever made, Stanley Kubrick, Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, none of them ever won a competitive Oscar for Best Director. Isn't that wild?
Actually, here is a statistic that perfectly hits the nail on the head for this explainer. The great Stanley Kubrick, the visionary genius behind The Shining, A Clockwork Orange, Dr. Strangelove, he only ever won a single Academy Award in his entire illustrious career. Just one. And what was it for? Visual effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey. It just goes to show that even for the masters who never get that ultimate top prize, their technical prowess is absolutely undeniable.
So, when a director like Steven Spielberg or Christopher Nolan finally secures that major category sweep, it acts as a bridge, right? It bridges the gap between massive blockbuster filmmaking and undeniable critical art. But it leaves us with one final, really provocative thought. If awards don't actually define a filmmaker's legacy, are the Oscars a measure of true artistic merit or just an industry popularity contest finally catching up to reality? I want to hear from you. Which legendary director do you think was robbed of an Oscar for way too long? And hey, which movie from our explainer today is your absolute personal favorite? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. And if you loved exploring this piece of cinema history with me, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next explainer. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep